Bonjour, bonjour, and welcome to another episode. And what a episode it is, folks, of Metis Time Capsule. Of course, I'm your host, Alexandria Anthony, and I want to put this out there. Have any of you ever heard of a Canadian Métis man awarded the U.S. Medal of Freedom? Of course, this medal was established in July of 1945 under an executive order, and this Medal of Freedom was awarded to persons who performed a meritorious act or service during the Second World War. And today we are absolutely honored to talk about Métis hero Archie Villebrun, who was, of course, awarded the Medal of Freedom. And this really comes to light with something that I wrote, and I think it really fits with this story. One isn't necessarily born with courage, but one is, of course, born with potential. And without courage, we just can't practice any other virtue with consistency. And we can't be, of course, be kind, true, merciful, generous, or honest. And a coward gets scared and quits, but a true hero gets scared but still goes on. And of course, us Métis were born with an invisible superhero cape. Our sash just keeps us grounded to family and community, our sense of kinship, and that fits perfect with this truly amazing true story of a Métis man, his heroism and unselfish act to save others. And just a bit of background, folks, so we can get sort of our mindset for this story. And during World War II, of course, the American and Canadian governments were engaged in a joint project called Cano, and the objective was to build an oil pipeline from the Norman Wells on the Mackenzie River southwest to the Pacific coast. And the pipeline was viewed as necessary to transport light grade oil for the expected war effort and the Aleutian Islands. And of course, such large undertaking using, of course, air support would not be complete without a, a tragedy involving, of course, aircraft and real heroic rescue on the Mackenzie River by our Métis hero, Archie Villebrun. And Archie, of course, is a Métis man who was born at Fort Chipewyan in 1905. And at the age of 14, he was hired as a deckhand on a boat running on the Slave River. And after, of course, years of experience, he studied navigation. That'll be key in the story, navigation, and then qualified as a first mate. And he was also employed by various transport companies, including the Hudson Bay Company, Alberta, and Arctic Transport Company, owned by J.K. Cornwall. And shortly after World War II, so this is our mindset, folks. I want you to sort of put this all in perspective. We're right after World War II broke out. And of course, Archie became a captain and he was involved with transporting U.S. troops. That's something that I had no idea, but I learned something from Waterway to Fort Smith for, of course, the Canal Project. And in 1943, Archie, of course, was the captain of the Imperial Oil motor vessel W.L. Taylor. And the boat was being used for geological survey work on the Mackenzie and Bear Rivers. And August 1943, this is where the story really begins. A huge storm was brewing on the Mackenzie River, and the storm was coming out, of course, was coming out of the north with high winds and snow. And with such strong winds coming against the current, the waves were increasing in height. And of course, Archie made haste for the closest safe haven, that being, of course, the mouth of the Great Bear River. And later, it's quoted later, Archie later commented that it was the worst storm that he had ever experienced, that was tearing down from the north, and he decided to make for shelter. And the Mackenzie is 6 miles wide at that point. The wind was blowing at 68 miles per hour, and the waves, can you imagine it? The waves were running as high as 20 feet. And we are so blessed today and honored to have Archie Villebrun's daughter, Noeline Villebrun, join us too. And you'll hear the emotion in her voice. And I was emotional actually reading about this story and learning about it on the heroism in a blinding snowstorm of her father in regards to seeing a pilot trying to set down a Norseman plane during when a huge wave caught the pontoons and turned the aircraft over, and the plane was upside down. It still remained uh, floating. So I'm really thrilled and honored to be able to have Noeline, of course, Villebrun, join us to give a perspective on her father's heroism. And one of the key things that sort of struck me in when Archie made the comment that he stated that for more than an hour he circled the plane, making 7 complete circuits before he could get near, and he couldn't see. He was just blinded. He couldn't see anything at times in the wheelhouse because of the water that was pouring over the house. And just his act of heroism, and again, a prime example of Métis people, where kinship and community, we just help out searching the storm. And finally, Archie got to the boat close enough to toss lines to the four people on the plane, and we hauled them aboard. There were 5 persons aboard, including a girl stenographer, and the fifth occupant of the plane, a mechanic, was drowned before we reached the shore. So again, it's so grateful to have Noeline Villebrun join us to tell the story of her father, Archie Villebrun. And I won't spoil the rest of the story for you, but again, this really shows you the basis of Métis people, kinship, community, and helping each other out. And Nolene will go more into that in regards to elders and all that. And Nolene also did mention that Blair Jean, of course, was a historian that came upon the story in regards to Archie Villebrun. And sadly, Archie Villebrun passed away on February 8th, 1977, at Yellowknife, and is buried in the Lakeview Cemetery, of course, in at Yellowknife. And some background for a lot of you that may not know, Fort Norman, of course, was established in 1810 by the Northwest Company. The post, of course, was taken over by the Hudson Bay Company in 1821, and in 1969, Fort Norman was renamed to Sitka. So again, listen and you'll hear the emotion in Noeline Villebrun's voice as she retells the story in regards to the heroism of her father, Archie Villebrun. Okay, Tanji, bonjour, and welcome to another episode of Métis Time Capsule. I'm your host, Alexandria Anthony, and we are so honored today to have Noeline Villebrun join us today to talk about her father, who is really a Métis hero, Archie Villebrun. So thank you, Noeline, for joining Métis Time Capsule. And let's go into the story of your heroic father.
Hi, Alexandra, I really appreciate for having me on this show and for having this program, Metis Capsule.
Yeah, Métis.
I think that's a very, and I guess for our future generation, they'll always have that information will be there.
That's right.
Right?
Yeah, they need to have, I think everybody, I mean, our history, our culture, our heroes, our legends. It's so important for our future, which you, like you said, is our children, to know these people who've really made an impact on who we are today.
Hi. Yeah. Well, it's interesting how or things happen. And I always say things happen for a reason. Meaning, just before Christmas, I got this text from my granddaughter, and she was in our community called Fort Resolution. That's a community that was created by the Hudson Bay and the Roman Catholic Church.
Right.
So there's a lot of history there too. And so she texts me and she said, "Grandma, is this your father?" So I looked at the download, and there was an article by Blair Jean. He's an author, historian,
Right.
and he's on Facebook. So it started out with he went right into 1943, and it's called Rescue at Bear Rock. And he talks about, or I shouldn't say not just him, I think he might have gotten out of an article, like a newspaper.
Right.
So he wrote, during World War II, the American and Canadian government were engaged in a joint project called Canal, which that line is not, didn't come into play, but there's still a lot of, it's still there.
Okay.
Not being used, right?
Right.
But the objective for that Canal pipeline was to build an oil pipeline from Norman Wells on the Mackenzie River southwest of the Pacific coast.
Right.
Pipeline was viewed as necessary, right, to transport light grade oil. And for the unexpected war effort in the Aleutian Islands, such a large undertaking using air support would not be completed without tragedy involving aircraft. And in this story, a heroic rescue on the Mackenzie River, and I believe it's on the Great Bear Lake,
right.
By Archie Villebrun, who is my father.
That is amazing.
So Archie Villebrun, they wrote, a Métis man, because we are of mixed blood.
Yeah.
We have French Villebrun, and the name Villebrun comes from around the Red River area.
Yeah.
Saskatchewan, I guess. Is that Manitoba or Saskatchewan?
Red River. Yeah, Red River is Manitoba.
But I believe it was probably between two provinces, the rebellion. But
Saskatchewan, Manitoba, yeah.
It says here, Archie Villebrun, a Métis man, was born at Fort Chipewyan in 1905. By the age of 14, he was hired as a deckhand on a boat running on the Slave River. After some years of experience, he studied navigation and qualified as a first mate. He served in this capacity on boats such as the SS Northland Echo, the SS Athabasca, and the SS Distributor. This had him employed by transport companies, including the Hudson Bay Company, Alberta and Arctic Transportation Company, and Northern Transportation Company owned by J.K. Cornwall.
Wow.
When Jim Cornwall was moving buffalo from the railhead at Waterways to Wood Buffalo National Park in 1926 with his streamer SS Northland Echo, Archie Villebrun was one of the crew. He was about 20 years old at the time, and Shortly after World War II broke out in 1939, Archie became a captain. He was involved with transporting U.S. troops from waterways to Fort Smith for the Canal Project. And I'd spoken to you earlier about the rapids, they call the Roaring Rapids.
Yep, you sure did.
By Fort Smith, yeah. So in 1943, Archie was the captain of the Imperial Oil Motor Vessel W.L. Taylor. The boat was being used for geological survey work on the Mackenzie and Bear Rivers. In August of that year, a storm was brewing on the Mackenzie River. It was coming out of the north. Along with high winds came snow. When strong winds coming against the current, with such strong winds coming against the current, the waves were increasing in height. Archie made haste for the closest safe haven, that being the mouth of the Great Bear Lake. The Bear River flowed in from the east, coming from Great Bear Lake. Like a sentinel, the high mountain named Bear Rock looms over the river's entrance. Archie later commented, "The worst storm I have ever experienced tore down from the north, and I decided to make for shelter. The Mackenzie is 2.5 miles wide at that point. The wind was blowing at 68 miles per hour, and the waves were running at as high as 20 feet. Wow. In addition, there was a blinding snowstorm. And usually around that time of the year, you'll get both snow and rain
mixed together, yeah.
Although the boat was being tossed about and the blowing snow made visibility difficult, Archie spotted a float plane coming toward him. For some unknown reason, it was attempting to land on that tormented water. Was the plane out of fuel? Was the pilot trying to find Fort Norman? Perhaps the top of Bear Rock was the only landmark the pilot could see in the storm, as he looked for a landing route onto the Bear River. The pilot managed to set the Norseman plane down, but a huge wave caught the pontoons and turned the aircraft over. Although the plane was upside down, it remained floating. The occupants of the plane attempted to save themselves from drowning. Once out of the submerged aircraft cabin, they pulled themselves up onto the floats. Cold and exposed to the elements, they clung to the pontoons as the plane pitched in the waves. The plane remained in the same general area as the high winds and the waves were at odds with the current of the Mackenzie River. Archie stated, "For more than an hour, I circled the plane, making 7 complete circuits before I can get near. I could see nothing at times in the wheelhouse because of the water that poured over the house. I had to hold the wheel with one hand while I regulated the throttle with the other. I have never seen a storm like it on the Mackenzie, and I have been on the river 23 years. Finally, we got the boat close enough to toss the lines to the 4 people on the plane, and we hauled them aboard. There were 5 persons aboard, including a girl stenographer. The 5th occupant of the plane, a mechanic, was drowned before he reached the scene. The survivors were in bad shape, and we had to revive them with rum and hot water. I ran the boat into the shelter of Bear River until the storm was over, then sailed for Fort Norman." Archie reported that such high seas, it was a miracle that they got the people off the plane. The efforts of the engineer of the MV W.L. Taylor, a man from Yellowknife, to keep the engines running were essential to the rescue. This was no easy task, as the engines wanted to quit. In fact, once they reached the shelter of Bear River, the engines died. Archie's 2 other crew members were a deckhand and a radio operator. One of the rescued was Charles Carngran, head of Marine Operations Limited on the Canal Project. He had been flying from Fort Simpson to Norman when they were caught in the storm. 1946, when the war was over, Archie Villebrun was recognized for his part in rescuing the 4 Americans from the wind-tossed waters of the Mackenzie River. Notice came to him in Yellowknife that he was to be decorated at the Northwest Air Command RCAF Gymnasium in Edmonton. It was arranged that famous Northern flyer Matt Berry would fly Archie to Edmonton. The newspapers ran the story. Tuesday, the United States Army. Sorry.
That's okay.
I just got emotional.
That's understandable.
Tuesday, the United States Army honored a colorful Alberta-born hero with the award of the Medal of Freedom. The medal was presented to Archie Villebrun, a 37-year-old Northland riverboat captain and pilot, trapper, and prospector. Colonel William W. Jones, commanding USAAF Air Transport Command Detachment in Edmonton, presented the medal, which was for the successful rescue of 4 Americans from a sinking plane in the Mackenzie River on August 31st, 1943. Wow, this is neat. Detachments from the Canadian Army, the Royal Canadian Air Force, and the United States Air Force formed the honor guard for my father.
Isn't that
amazing? When he walked through.
That's absolutely amazing.
Anyways, they had additional information. Archie Villebrun was born at Fort Chipewyan, close to it, in 1905. And Archie Villebrun, on his father's side, Archie Villebrun was the grandson of Francis Villebrun and his wife Marie St. Cyr, who married at Fort Chipewyan in 1866. Francois Villebrun was born in Manitoba and first came to the Athabasca district in 1864 as a milieu or middleman with the Hudson Bay Company transportation brigades from Red River. By 1874, Francois Villebrun was the steersman for the HBC Transport Scows and was also employed by the Hudson Bay for general services at Fort Chipewyan. His annual salary of $150 was a large amount at the time by Hudson Bay standards. So it says here the U.S. Medal of Freedom was established in July of 1945 under an executive order. This Medal of Freedom was awarded to persons who perform a meritorious act or service during Second World War, which aided the United States in the persecution of the war against her enemies.
Absolutely.
Wow.
You know what? Really, even when I read the story about your father, I seen the information.
So
the information is so overwhelming. Okay, that's great. I think it's an amazing story. I know when I read the story, a lot of people aren't aware of this story, and I mean, it's just amazing to have your father as a hero. So, what are what are some of the feedback that you got on this story about your father?
Well, it was in, I would say, around 1985, 86. I would say, no, 80, yeah, 85, around that time in the 80s, early 80s. I was living in Norman Wells.
Right.
I had a family. And anyways, I got a phone call. A friend had said there was an elder and his daughter that were at the airport. They needed a place to stay overnight. They couldn't fly in the weather.
Right.
So they came to the house, and it was Wilfred Lenny and his daughter. And then he found out that Archie was my dad. And when he found out, that's when he told me this story. But he didn't go into in depth. He just said, I know your dad. I remember your dad. Many of us remember him because he saved these American people's lives. He said 4 of them. And he said when nobody would go out, he went out. Because I was on the Mackenzie River when a big, like a storm came up, and it was terrible. So I understand, you know, because I've been on that river and I've been on the lakes, right? Right now I'm sitting on Great Slave Lake.
Wow.
This is where I come. Yeah.
Amazing.
It's frozen, but you know, you're always, like, if you're, the way I see it, if my body and my mind and my spirit says, okay, you need a break, well, I come to the lake.
Right.
Whether it's frozen or not. And that's I guess what we're born with.
That's right. And I think,
Yeah, it's in us.
yeah, and I think, Noeline, I think your father, Archie Villebrun, really shows the spirit, the courage of tribal people, and how, they'll come to the rescue of somebody, and they'll just do what needs to be done to save these 4 people. A lot of courage, and I think it's incredible that your father and this is a story that a lot of people are probably not aware of. Being awarded the Medal of Freedom was a huge thing. It's just amazing.
You know, I thought about that, and I talked. Of course, I sent the article to my sister. There's only 2 of us left for my children and my father. So, she says, you know what, Noeline, when we were young, I wasn't born yet, and my father had 2 families. His first wife died, and had 3 girls, and my father married my mother and had my brother and I. So I was telling my sister, Dene people, we, the way our traditions, practices, and beliefs are, when you do good for others, you don't brag about it. It's between you and the creator and that person. And the way my grandmother explained it to me also, she said, when you do good and if somebody's really struggling or, needs help, and you help them and you go and brag about it, that doesn't make that person feel good, because, they need help. And, sometimes, things happen. And so I said that to my sister. I said, that's probably why Dad didn't talk about it. And she says, well, I never seen the medal. And I said, well, knowing Dad, it's probably somewhere in a cabin on his trap line.
Right.
And his cache, what they call cache, it's what our men did between in their trap lines. They would leave what they call a cache hanging in case something happens. There's matches, there's tea, just the basic to get, to keep you going.
Right.
They have hanging, and it's still there.
Wow.
According to my cousin John Toronjo, that started using the trap line. So I can see that, and that about my father, because that's what I remember about my my father. He was always gentle. He was always he's never raised his voice at me.
Wow.
He always explained things.
Mm-hmm.
And so, and he was kind. He was a kind man. And I've had many people tell me when they knew that was my dad, they would say, I know your dad. He's a good man. He's a kind man. He'll help anybody.
Amazing.
So, but that's the value of our tribal people. It's not just the Dene. It's all tribal peoples in the world, they have that, we have that common, what they call common denominator, or whatever they say in English. But for myself, there's certain things we abide by. And as tribal people, we don't leave anybody behind.
That's true. That's very, very true. And like I said,
Hmm.
it's such an amazing story, and I think the purpose of having you on the show really is to
Hmm.
highlight your father and his courage and just his philosophy of those tribal values that they do exist, and I think that
Hmm.
you should be proud of you come from a long line of tribal people, and it's just completely amazing.
Exactly. And my father, and if, when I read that article and they said he was, they taught him instruments and that, my father was an alert man. He was going to become a priest, and he went to, um, in Fort Resolution, I believe there was a, that's where the biggest Roman Catholic church they called mission back then, and housed, a lot of students.
Right.
St. Joseph Catholic Church ran the residential schools for years, right?
Right.
So my father was going to become a priest,
Oh,
and yeah, so he learned to read and write, and I think he learned Latin. But my
wow.
father also, yeah, he spoke many dialects, like all the dialects up and down the Mackenzie River. He spoke and
Amazing.
understood.
Yes.
Mhm.
Wow.
Mhm.
He was, really a learned individual. And like I said, he was, uh, amazing that, he was started from being a deckhand and moved his way to be a captain. And, when I read about him and, like I said, the Medal of Freedom, it was really just astounding to me, the honor bestowed on him for just, you know, him just doing his tribal values and, like you said, not leaving a person behind. Instinctual.
Mhm. Mhm. Well, that's what I, you know, was told about my father. And another he had a nickname back home, back in Fort Smith area, between Fort Smith, Fort Chipewyan, that area. They gave him the nickname the lawyer,
Wow.
because my father would help all of our relatives that couldn't read or write and didn't understand any of these policies and laws the federal government was implementing. So my father did a lot of reading and helping. So when you fast forward about, I would say, 30 years ago, I was in Fort Smith, but I was living in Fort Resolution, and I got a call by the elders and some of the elders in Fort Smith. There's turmoil in the community, elections and all that stuff, and it was terrible. Anyways, they called me and asked me if I would come in for the weekend and spend the weekend with them and explain to them what was going on and why was things working the way they were, right?
Right.
So I said okay, and told my husband what was going on. He agreed. So not that I was asking his permission, and just we, talking, and he said okay. And so I spent the weekend in Fort Smith with the elders, and one of them looked at me and said, Noeline, your father did this exactly around 30 years ago too. So when I go back on the time frame, it was like 30 years ago that I was told this. Now 30 years later, I'm talking about it, but I'm, talking about my father, how our our Dene people have done so many things in their lifetime to help others, And yes, they should get recognition by society standards, right?
Right.
But our tribal people were not like that.
Right.
And so when the elder told me, he said, your dad was doing exactly this about 30 years ago. He said, explaining things to us and that. And he says, here you are. And I thought, wow.
Well, yeah, you're
And
actually following in your father's footsteps, and like I said, Noeline, you've been such an inspiration to me, and I know you're actually your father, with his wisdom, his knowledge was helping the people, and you're like I said, you're following in those footsteps on helping people, educating people to understand what's going on, and it comes full circle, really. And it's just
mhm,
your father, an amazing legacy, and I became quite emotional, like I said, reading about your father as well, and just being an
mhm,
inspiration. And that's why I think that these stories need to be told. They need to be remembered by everybody, the huge achievements, just to educate our people on how far we've come, and the great knowledge, the platform of knowledge that we're reaching up from.
mhm. Yes.
And
And I'm grateful um, that someone took that story, but I guess it's because it is news. Because by today's standard, too, right?
right,
He would he would be recognized, but probably in a there'd be more people, because the way we are today in society, when we want to recognize somebody, we all attend a function.
that's right.
And back in around 1940s, there was um, there was no airport. I don't believe there was an airport here back then.
Mm-hmm.
So they were using float planes, the Norsemen, right?
Yeah.
So I could I could see why, they just it was like a small scale, but just reading that part about where they did an honor guard, I could see that. I could visualize it.
Well, that
And
I mean, that's just you talking about it just now. I can have the visual. Can you just imagine? It's just
mhm,
absolutely amazing. And you know, things at the end of the Second World War, or 1940, 46. I mean, to have your father recognized, I mean, was it was just absolutely amazing. And like I said, um, looking even at the actual Medal of Freedom itself, I mean, what an honor. And
mhm,
I just it's just an amazing story, to tell our youth, and to tell everybody, because
mhm,
part of being tribal people is our storytelling, and this is one of those stories that we need to get out there. And like I
mhm,
said, I think it's such an honor. This really puts the our segment over the top, to have Archie's daughter tell the story. And it's made it more emotional for me, because reviewing my notes on this story, I thought, man, this is a story that needs to be told on the platform. But to have you, as his daughter, tell the story, I think, like I said, it just puts the butter on the bannock, as they say, and it's just absolutely amazing. And I want to thank you
mhm.
for joining us, and to give a more a personal feel to this story, because we all have a story to tell. And this is a real amazing story. And again, I want to thank you for honoring us, and allowing us to honor your father,
Marcy Cho.
Marcicho. And
Uh,
again, my dear,
mhm. My
it's
my father just also understood and spoke Michif.
Wow.
Hmm.
So he was
Even though we're of mixed bloods,
right,
we didn't gender or pull towards the French
right.
because up here we're all Dene.
Yes,
And so, there is mixed blood, but my grandmother did not look at me in that manner that I was of mixed blood or whatever. I was her granddaughter.
right.
She taught me the language,
Uh,
and that I am grateful for.
absolutely. I mean,
And mhm,
but again, Nolene, like I said, it's been a huge, huge honor to have you join us today to speak about your father and an amazing tribal person. You are an amazing tribal person. And again, thank you for taking the time to give, a real perspective on your father and just an amazing, amazing person. So we want to thank you for joining us.
mhm, Marcy Cho.
Marcicho.